Thanks for coming today. In 1999, I was in my final undergraduate year at university. And at the time, the Israelis were bombing southern Lebanon. There was a wide-scale campaign of bombing. So as student activists on the campus, we gathered and we decided to organize a strike in my university in solidarity with the Lebanese resistance at the time. So the protest started by us standing in the middle of campus on the chairs, and we were leading, the chants and making speeches that were all about the Lebanese resistance and the Palestinian resistance, and we were denouncing US imperialism and we were denouncing Zionism. That's how the protest started. Few minutes into the protest, the focus of the speeches and the chants started to change slightly into why isn't our government not doing enough to help the Palestinians and the Lebanese? And few minutes later, the focus once again started to change slightly into, and why is our government that doesn't want to help the Palestinians and the Lebanese is opening up an Israeli embassy in the heart of Cairo? Few minutes later into the protest, the focus started to slightly change again into why is our government that doesn't want to help the Palestinians and the Lebanese, that's opening up an Israeli embassy in the heart of Cairo, is also exporting cement to Israel that's being used in building the Israeli settlements. Few minutes later, the speeches and the chants spontaneously started to shift once again into why is our government that doesn't want to help the Palestinians and the Lebanese, that's opening up an Israeli embassy in the heart of Cairo, that's exporting cement to help Israel, instead of sending troops to help the Palestinians and the Lebanese, they are sending troops to besiege our university campus. Few minutes later, the shift started to change once again into, well, the same government that doesn't want to help the Palestinians and the Lebanese that's sending us troops is also the same government that's giving us a shitty educational system, that's giving us bad housing rights, that is oppressing the peasants in Upper Egypt and burning their sugarcane fields during its counterinsurgency. So as you can see, we started with solidarity with the Palestinians and the Lebanese. By the end of the protests, we were discussing the bilharzia disease that's eating up the peasants in the south. We were discussing the housing crisis. We were discussing the lack of democracy in Egypt. And comrades, that's what the Palestinian cause always does when it comes to Arab politics and specifically Egyptian politics. The Palestinian cause is the biggest and the most important radicalizing and politicizing factor for the Egyptian youth. 99.9% of Egyptian youth, including myself back in the day, our gateway into politics usually starts with pro-Palestine activism. You start extending your solidarity with the Palestinians, you start thinking regional solidarity with your brethren and sisters in the rest of the region, and your focus immediately starts changing into Cairo. This is not something new. This has always been the case in Egypt. Shall we go with the first slide, please? The history, most of the important turning points in Egyptian history. Please go back. Yes, that's the first one. Most of the important turning points in Egyptian history is either directly or indirectly related to Palestine. Whenever you mention the year 1968, everyone thinks of the global year of revolt, of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, of the US college occupations against the war in Vietnam, of the European student struggles at the time, of the French May and the general strike in May 68 in France. But the Arab world also had its own 1968, which is seldomly discussed in revolutionary literature abroad. I mean abroad here outside the Arab world. So in February 1968, for the first time, the Egyptian students took to the streets for the first time since 1954. 1954, that's like 2 years after the military coup that saw the free officers rising to power in Egypt and consolidating the regime by 1954. The first time that there were mass protests against the regime happened in February 1968. This is a picture of the Cairo University students crossing the Nile to marching on the parliament at the time. Why did they start protesting? It was because of the defeat in front of Israel. They were radicalized by the defeat in front of the Zionist state. And the trigger was the light sentences that were given to the army generals who were blamed for the defeat. And actually, the protest started by the Hilwan workers south of Cairo who took to the streets to protest the light sentences. The police opened live ammunition on them. So the workers actually went to Ain Shams University, which is the second largest university in Egypt, sent delegations, told the students what was happening, and then the workers and the students started marching in downtown Cairo, and they were joined by Cairo University students that you see here in the picture, and other mobilizations started to happen across the country. The Nasser regime panicked. The protests were put down brutally, but also Nasser promised reforms in March, 1 month after those protests. And the war of attrition, which was a commando operations launched by the Egyptian military, started and lasted for 2 years because Nasser was under so much pressure from the student movement that got revived thanks to the defeat in front of Israel, so as to start responding to the Israeli aggression and to liberate Sinai. Second picture, please. 1968 happened in 2 waves, in February and November 1968. And this triggered a long wave of radicalization in Egyptian politics. Is there anyone of you here who's studying Middle Eastern politics or Middle Eastern history at university or anything? Usually, when it comes to the literature that we study about the history of the Middle East, they tell you the failure of secular nationalism in 1967 led to the rise of Islamism afterwards. But actually, this is a misreading of the time. Actually, the defeat that happened in 1967 and which triggered this long process of social mobilizations created or revived the Egyptian communist movement at the time. Egyptian communism is usually divided into waves because literally they would come as a wave and then they would collapse and then they would stay like for a decade where there is nothing happening, and then there is another wave and then it goes on. So the first wave we documented from the year 1919 with our first anti-colonial revolution till 1924, and that's when the post-independence government of Saad Zaghloul, the liberal leader of Egypt at the time, crushed the communist movement and the independent unions and crushed the labor strikes at the time, and this was the end of the first communist wave. The second communist wave, which was the strongest, started in the late 1930s and reached its peak by 1946, and that's 1 year after the end of the Second World War. And at the time, the Brits had promised all of its colonies independence if they stood by Britain in the war. And of course, when it came to delivery, the Brits, as usual, tried to renegade on their promises. So this triggered mass strikes in Egypt in 1946. And at the time, they were the biggest strikes in our modern history. And the communists played a central role at the time. But Egyptian communism was finished by mid-60s, both under repression by the Nasser regime and by the ideological distortions of the movement itself, which we can go into some other time because it involves so much details that might be irrelevant to our talk tonight. 1968 revived the Egyptian left, and that's when you had the third wave of Egyptian communism. Someone like my father, for example, who grew up as a staunch Nasser supporter and came from a railway workers' family in Tanta, which is in the Nile Delta, and he believed in Nasser deeply. When 1967 happened, he went back home, tore down Nasser's posters, and put up Mao's at the time. And he was not alone. This was the time when you had the Cultural Revolution happening in China, and very few people knew what actually it was really about, but it was like a symbol of radicalism. So this triggered a new wave of the Egyptian left that was largely inspired by the Palestinian resistance. In April 1968, you had the Karama battle, where 300 Fatah guerrillas managed to defeat an Israeli force of roughly 1,500 who tried to cross into Jordan in order to punish the Palestinian guerrillas for their operations. As soon as the Palestinians managed to inflict defeat on the Israelis in that battle, there are reports that at least 20,000 Egyptians tried to enlist in the Fatah movement at the time. And in the later mobilizations that happened in Egypt, most importantly in 1971, 1972, and in 1972 specifically, that's when the Egyptian leftist students managed to nationally mobilize and occupy Tahrir Square in scenes that would be very much similar to what we will see in the following century with the 2011 revolution. When I interviewed some of the student leaders at the time who took part in this 1972 Tahrir occupation, they would tell me that the army would send in officers from the so-called Administration of Moral Affairs. That's the branch of the military that's in charge of military propaganda in Egypt. And these officers would show up and will try to disorient the students and try to convince them to suspend their protests. And the students would immediately tell them, like, who do you think yourselves are? You know, the Palestinians are doing this, the Vietnamese are doing that. And they would start citing immediately the Palestinian resistance operations so as to respond to the propaganda of the Egyptian military. Sadat at the time did not want any sort of wars, not even a liberation war in order to liberate Sinai. But thanks to the pressure of that student movement that were largely inspired by the Palestinian resistance, Sadat had to launch a limited war in 1973. The war, which was depicted as a victory, excuse me, which was depicted as a victory in Egypt, temporarily diffused the national question, but it gave ground to the social question. In 1974, Sadat started his open door or infitah policy, which was a neoliberal transition. In case you didn't know, Sadat's Egypt and Pinochet's Chile were the pioneers of neoliberalism in the global south. We were the first two countries to start enacting neoliberal reforms at the time. Immediately, the social movement got revived. 1975, 1976, you started to have very important strikes in Hilwan, south of Cairo, in Mahalla, which is in the Nile Delta, and it includes the biggest textile mill in the Middle East. And the public transport workers in Cairo went on strike, bringing the entire capital to a halt. And guess what? Those who were leading those social movements in Egypt were the alumni of the societies of the supporters of the Palestinian revolution on university campuses. جمعيات أنصار الثورة الفلسطينية جمعيات أنصار الثورة الفلسطينية at the time. They started organizing on behalf of the Palestinians, and immediately they became the leaders at the forefront of social dissent in Egypt. This continuous mobilizations from 1968 onwards led in the end to January 1977, we had a bread uprising, as we dubbed it in Egypt, انتفاضة العيش or انتفاضة الخبز. And that's when Egyptians woke up to find that Sadat had eliminated most of the subsidies on basic commodities, including bread, in Egypt at the time. For 2 days, there was a national uprising. There was a general strike in Egypt. There were confrontations in the streets all throughout, from Cairo to Aswan in the south. Sadat was in Aswan, and he was about to receive Joseph Tito of Yugoslavia at the time. And when he saw the riots, he was thinking seriously about taking a plane and leaving the country to escape. And when Sadat gave an order to the military to go into the streets to put down the uprising, the Minister of Defense told him, I cannot guarantee the loyalty of the troops. You have to revoke first your economic decrees before I send in the troops. And that's what happened. Our neoliberal reforms were put on freeze, and the army tanks were sent in with the special forces and the paratroopers in order to crush the uprising at the time. Next. Now, in the following decade, this was the beginning of the end of the Egyptian left. By 1977, the left had been dominant since 1968 for an entire decade, and it didn't lead anywhere. They managed to mobilize, they managed to strike, they managed to keep on protesting, but when they had their chance at a revolution, they failed to materialize this into real change. And at the same time, you started having the rise of Islamism that was initially backed by the state to counterweight or to counterbalance the leftists, but then it became its own Frankenstein, and the radical wing of the Islamist jihadi movement at the time managed to assassinate Sadat in 1981. Throughout the 1980s, these were years of stagnation economically, stagnation politically. This was when Mubarak had reached office or assumed office following Sadat's demise. And the labor movement was largely dead. The left was largely dead. I joined university as a first-year student in 1995, in the mid-1990s. And Egypt at the time was, it was one of the most horrible epochs. Of course, it cannot be compared to today, which is even more horrible, and I will discuss it in a bit. But at the time, this was the height of our dirty war, the first dirty war. And it was a dirty war Latin American style. The kind of things that you would read about Argentina and about, what happened in the rest of the Latin American countries against the leftists at the time, it was happening in Egypt, but against the Islamists. And you start by targeting alleged terrorists, and then the crackdowns goes, or the web entrenches basically everyone in society. And here, I want to highlight a simple fact which usually people tend to forget. Our first war on terror was launched in 1991, 1992. And this is not a coincidence. This is also the same year that Egypt signed the AirSAP agreement with the IMF and the World Bank, the Economic Reform and Structural Adjustment Program. After procrastinating for roughly 2 decades, the Egyptian regime only managed to get its bravery and guts to resume its social attack against the working class and against society, and to start implementing austerity policies only at a decade and a half or 2 decades after 1977, in 1991, 1992. And comrades, if you look around the world, you will always find that wars on terror and wars on crime and wars on drugs and all of these wars, they always happen simultaneously with neoliberal reforms. Because on the one hand, the state withdraws from the social sphere, they embark on social attacks against the working class and the poor in your society, and you militarize your police forces, you implement or impose emergency laws, and you tend to engulf the whole society into paranoia and political fears, so as to be able to crush any sort of dissent that might result from those austerity policies. When I joined university in 1995, the situation was dismal. As student activists, we knew our limits. You could not whisper Mubarak's name. You could not talk about Mubarak. You could not talk about Gamal Mubarak, his son. You could not mention his families. At best, you can talk about the regime, you can talk about the government, you can slam some ministers, but Hosni Mubarak's name was a huge taboo. One of the first protests that I organized, or I helped to organize, was in 1998. That's when the Americans were bombing Iraq. And when we left the university campus and took to the streets in Mohammed Mahmoud Street in downtown Cairo, and then the Central Security Forces showed up, I started chanting against Mubarak. And in a few seconds, I looked behind you and everyone was running for their lives, and I was like the only one in front of the police, at the time. You could not talk about Mubarak. And in some other protests, like our coordination committees as student activists, they used to come to me, Hossam, you and the communists, you always want to talk about Mubarak. We're here for Palestine, don't get us into trouble. Please, just keep your speeches to Palestine and that's it. Don't mention Egypt, at all. And this was the atmosphere of fear that existed in Egypt at the time. I'm not saying this to ridicule them, although some of them definitely deserve to be ridiculed, but I can understand the climate of fear. But this was the climate of fear that we were trying to push back against as radical leftists at the time. And it is my generation that basically launched the fourth wave of Egyptian communism, reviving the leftist cells on the campuses slowly at the time. And comes the year 2000, and the entire rules of the game change. Once again, thanks to Palestine. The second Palestinian Intifada took place, or broke out. And when the first Intifada broke out, this triggered also some important protests on the Egyptian campuses at the time. But what was different with the second Palestinian Intifada is that you had Al Jazeera that was streaming live to every Egyptian home or to large sections of Egyptian society pictures of the atrocities that were happening around the clock. And not only pictures of atrocities, but also pictures of resistance. Egyptians started to see with their own eyes Palestinian kids taking on Israeli tanks. And they immediately started drawing parallels. If those Palestinians can confront the strongest army in the region using rocks, we can confront Mubarak's armored personnel carriers and police troops. It's not impossible. It's not a crazy idea. If these guys are fighting the Israelis with rocks, why can't we do the same? The Intifada started on the 28th of September, 2000. The first week of October, there was a mass wave of protests across every single Egyptian university campus at the time. Although these campuses were largely dormant for a decade and sometimes 3 decades before. The militancy even started spilling over, and for the first time, literally since 1919 revolution, The kindergarten students were demonstrating in the streets. There were protests everywhere in Egypt. And again, they started with pro-Palestine slogans, with anti-US slogans, anti-Israeli slogans. But then, with the Central Security Forces, which is our riot police troops, show up with their sticks and tear gas and birdshot guns, and they start attacking the protesters, the focus immediately starts to become local. You start chanting against police brutality. But even in the year 2000, people had not yet broken completely the wall of fear when it comes to Mubarak. This wave of protests in October, that lasted in October and November, like the first 2 months, and then it was brutally crushed. I mean, this was my first experience of detention and torture by state security police at the time. But again, I mean, I was not alone. I mean, they went heavily on all student organizers on the campuses at the time. And mainly they were targeting the newly rising leftist cells in Egypt at the time. Now, this wave subsided only to be reignited once again in April 2002. And that's when Ariel Sharon sent his tanks to Jenin and the West Bank cities. And you had all of these horrible massacres happening in the West Bank that were aired live to every Egyptian house thanks to Al Jazeera at the time. And that's when you had the Cairo University Intifada, where basically the Cairo University students, joined by other students who sent in delegations, in addition to the residents of the urban poor and the middle class around the university campus, which is located in Giza. I mean, Cairo University is located in Giza. It's one of the crazy things about Egypt. But it's called Bain al-Sarayat, which is like socially mixed area. And there were running battles for 2 days. For 2 days, there were running battles, and the Central Security Forces, they were trying to disperse us by basically ramming their APCs, their armored personnel carriers, and their trucks into us, which were scenes that were very similar to what we saw a decade later in 2011. And this was the first time in my life that I saw thousands of people who were willing to chant against Mubarak fearlessly. The people were chanting, حسني مبارك زي شارون نفس الشكل ونفس اللون. حسني مبارك is just like Sharon. He's the same figure, he's the same color. People were drawing parallels immediately between Sharon and between Mubarak. Again, this was crushed brutally by the state security police forces and the Central Security Police Forces, only to reignite, once again in March 2003 with the invasion of Iraq. As soon as the Americans and the Brits and the Western Alliance went into Iraq, this triggered the biggest protest Egypt has witnessed or had witnessed since 1977, with 40,000 Egyptians in running street battles from the old Islamic Cairo, where Al-Azhar is located, all the way to Tahrir Square. This photo here is taken by a Canadian journalist, acquaintance of mine, of the protest on the 20th of March that we saw not only police brutality, but people were burning Mubarak's posters in Tahrir Square. People were setting fire to police trucks. People were just few meters away from reaching the US embassy, and they were fought back with water cannons by the police. These were scenes that we had not witnessed in Egypt since 1977. And this is coupled with continuous chanting against Hosni Mubarak. This is 2003. Only 3 years earlier, people like myself used to be voted out of organizing protests because we are the ones who want to talk about Hosni Mubarak. The wall of fear started to collapse brick by brick. These 3 years of regional mobilizations. Next one, please. These 3 years of regional mobilizations started to create for us a room in the streets to revive street politics. I mean, people like myself from my generation, like, the issue or the idea of having a protest in a street outside the university campus was a sci-fi. Was a sci-fi, story that we would not have imagined. But thanks to the mobilizations for 3 years, we've created a room so that on the 26th of June, 2004, on the International Day for the Solidarity with Victims of Torture, around 500, maybe less, mainly left-wing activists and human rights activists, whom, when you look at their faces, these were the same guys who were organizing on behalf of Palestine few years earlier. These were the same guys who were part of the anti-Iraq war few years earlier. They took the unprecedented step to call for a public protest against police torture. Now, previous protests, definitely there were chants against police torture, but you never called on the people to show up for an anti-police torture protest. You would call for a pro-Palestine protest, but you would know that at some point, the police will start cracking heads, so everyone will start chanting against police brutality. But this was the first time that we had the courage and we had the space to start organizing around a purely local issue, which is police torture. Next picture, please. Few months later, in December, on the 12th of December 2004, you had the launch of Kifaya. Kifaya is Arabic for enough, and it was an umbrella movement that included leftists and other forces that called on Mubarak to step down and not to groom his son Gamal for succession, because that's what Mubarak was planning at the time. And we held our first protest in front of the public prosecutor's office in Ramses Street in downtown Cairo. And if you look at the faces, these were the same pro-Palestine campaigners in the year 2000, 2002, 2003. These were the same guys who organized the anti-Iraq war protests. Now, the regional has become the local. And for someone like myself who had witnessed the 1990s and the fear that existed from whispering Mubarak's name, this day, it was unbelievable for me that we can have not only a public protest in a street, but we can also chant against Hosni Mubarak. Next, please. Now, over the following 2 years, there were continuous mobilizations by Kifaya, mainly in downtown Cairo, and Kifaya did not really attract mass following at the time. Meaning, Kifaya did not create working class roots, for example. We were mostly students, university graduates, pharmacists, doctors, journalists, writers, artists, engineers. So, mainly middle class. And there were some working class also people who were part of the movement. But the brilliance of Kifaya, in my view, was the media strategy that we had adopted at the time. Even when it comes to the most repressive regimes, there are always a give and take. Repression always have a formula. In the case, for example, of Tunisia, they had Ben Ali, who was a brutal dictator, but he allowed a little bit space for organizing by some unions, independent from the state. Hosni Mubarak used to crack down on people with certain ceiling, but would allow other things, and there were always give and take, even under the most repressive regimes. And at the time, the newly rising businessmen in Egypt who profiteered from the selling of the public sector, from the corrupt economic policies and the neoliberal policies at the time, they started to become an important section of the ruling coalition in Egypt. And they were surrounded, and they surrounded Gamal Mubarak, the president's son. And they started to create for themselves media arms, private media arms. But there was much more space for freedom of expression in those private media outlets compared to the state-run newspapers at the time. That, in addition to the rise of the satellite TV stations, we made good use of that. So before we organized any protests for Kifaya, we would contact like journalists before that and we tell them, you know, we're gonna show up at this X location here at that time, bring your cameras and come. So the biggest protest that Kifaya had ever organized included only 5,000 people, guys. And this was at a very unique opportunity in September 2005 when Mubarak was trying to put on a show that there will be multi-candidate presidential elections. So he left some space for us in the streets to organize without cracking our heads. So we managed to attract 5,000. But on average, the Kifaya protests only included either 20 people, and at a very, very good day, it can include 500 people. But we made sure that the visuals of these protests are disseminated nationally and actually internationally at the time. So if you were in Sharqiya province, or if you were in Alexandria, or if you were in Asyut, or elsewhere, and you feel pissed off with the current situation, and you hate Mubarak, but at the same time you think that you must be the only crazy one who's thinking about this. And suddenly you see on TV, those kids, from Kifaya, burning down Mubarak's posters in Tahrir Square, then you know that there are other crazy people like yourself. You're not the only crazy one. And then you start reaching out to those crazies in Cairo and elsewhere, and dissent starts to get diffused or proliferate even beyond our organizational reach. Next picture, please. So it's not a coincidence that in December 2006, that you would start getting the revival of the industrial actions in Egypt. On the 7th of December 2006, 3,000 female garment workers at Ghazl al-Mahalla, which is the largest textile mill in Egypt and in the Middle East, they went on strike. In case you didn't know, the textile industry is usually divided into spinning, weaving, and garments. Spinning and weaving is usually done by men, and the garment section and the garments industry is largely feminized. So the garments female workers, they went on strike in Ghazl al-Mahalla, and they started marching in the factory compound, demanding the 2 months bonuses that were promised earlier by our neoliberal Prime Minister Ahmed Nazif, who had promised these bonuses to the public sector workers. And of course, when it came to delivery time, he tried to renegade about it. And these female workers were going around and they were chanting, "Ir-Rijala fein, il-Harima hum." Where are the men? Here we are the women. It's a football chant that they have modified, a little bit. But basically, they shamed their male colleagues into action. That's when the entire textile mill went on strike, and 22,000 workers started their industrial action. They occupied the mill for 3 or 4 days, and despite security intimidation, they won. Next question, please. And from the moment they won, they triggered the so-called winter of labor discontent in Egypt, where every single textile mill, especially in the north of Egypt, went on strike, demanding the same gains as those of Ghazl al-Mahalla. So this is a picture that I took in Ghazl Kafr al-Dawar, which is located in Beheira. It's south of Alexandria. And this factory has very huge significance for the left. When the 1952 military coup happened by the free officers, the first thing that they did was to go to Kafr al-Dawar, crush a labor strike that was happening at the time, hold a military tribunal inside the factory compound, and then executing 2 communist workers, Al-Khamis wal-Baqari, at the time. So this factory holds so much significance for the left in general. And as soon as Mahalla won, every single textile mill in Egypt, especially in the north, started going on strike. This is a picture that I took at the 10th day of the strike. That's when victory was declared. And in all of these strikes, in Egypt, we didn't have independent trade unions like what you have in other countries. You have the state-backed General Federation of Trade Unions, which is a bureaucratic structure like the ones that existed in other autocracies, of basically acting as the regime's arm when it comes to mobilizing the working class, but they do not represent the workers. And when the strikes started taking place, the state-backed General Federation tried to actually suppress them. In the case of Ghazl Kafr al-Dawar, the workers basically, they took their trade unionists and they locked them up inside the factory. They were like, you're striking with us, you're not going anywhere, And they locked them up for 10 days, but they gave them food, at least they didn't starve them. So, and this was the moment that they won. Next slide, please. And from the moment they won, they triggered the winter of labor discontent, which is the longest and the strongest wave of sustained mass industrial actions in the history of the country since 1946. Since 1946. Every single factory in Egypt was going on strike. Every sector in Egypt was going on strike. And at the beginning, many people were dismissive of these industrial actions because, well, the workers are just like calling for, raising their salaries, but, they are not really talking about Hosni Mubarak and talking about, the constitution and the political reforms and this and that. But at the same time, I think that they failed to read in depth the wave. In a country where you have an emergency law that bans the assembly of more than 5 people together, more than 5 people, you're not allowed. And then you get 22,000 workers getting together in order to launch a strike and a sit-in, you are breaking the emergency law. In a country where if you go on strike over bread and butter issues, but you know that when you strike, state security police will be outside waiting for you when you go home so as to snatch you at night and torture you, and that the central security forces would be besieging your factory and they would beat the living shit out of you as soon as they manage, to storm the factory. Like what they used to do. They used to break strikes in the 1980s with live ammunition. It happened. And you still go on strike? That's a political decision. In a country where women are second and third class citizens, but you find that the industrial action was launched by women, and that in every single workplace that includes substantial presence of women, that they actually take the lead, challenging gender relations, that's politics. This is a picture that I took in 2007 of El Mansoura Espana garments factory, which is located in the Qahliya province in the Nile Delta. And it's a garment factory that used to export garments to Walmart and other things. And the workers were not getting paid for 6 months, and their salaries were very, very low. But they went on strike. They occupied their mill for 6 months. And during these 6 months, the female workers left their homes and they were sleeping under the same roof with men in order to keep the occupation alive. And in Egypt, that's a huge social taboo. In such a conservative province like that in the Nile Delta, a married woman cannot simply just leave her house, to go and sleep, somewhere else. And state security police used to come every night and threaten the women with prostitution charges. They used to incite their families into coming to try to basically grab their daughters to go back home. But they held out for 6 months. I mean, challenging gender relations, that's basically politics. In Egypt, 10 or 15% of the local population are Coptic Christians, and they are discriminated against. But in every single factory that I entered, or in every single sector that went on strike and had Coptic presence, like for example the railways, Muslim workers elected Coptic men to lead their own strike. The real estate tax collectors who went on strike for 3 months, during which tax collection dropped by 90%, they elected also Christians in order to lead the strike. So challenging the sectarian relations in our society and religious discrimination, that's politics. At the time, people like myself and others on the left, we were arguing that we should throw ourselves in the strike wave, and it will eventually start becoming much more political. The militancy started spilling over to other sectors of society. So this is, for example, a picture of one of the residents of Al-Atikabsh slum in Cairo that went on fire, and the government didn't want to compensate the urban poor, and they actually attacked them with tear gas. So they took to the streets and they besieged the parliament. That's the urban poor. Every single workers' meeting that I've attended at the time in Egypt, the textile workers used to be cited as an example for resistance. Comes February 2008, and 15,000 workers from Ghazl al-Mahalla, after a series of strikes, start demanding raising the national minimum wage in Egypt, which had not changed since the mid-1980s. And in February, they took to the streets in Mahalla, 15,000 of them, and they were joined by another 5,000. And those 20,000 started touring the city, and they were chanting against Mubarak. They were chanting against Gamal Mubarak. They were chanting against Susan Mubarak. They were carrying loaves of bread at the time because there was a bread crisis in Egypt, and some people were even fighting to death in front of bakeries in scenes that you would read only about in the French Revolution. And they threatened that if their demands are not met, they will go on a strike on the 6th of April 2008. Comes the 6th of April 2008, and the security forces occupied the Ghazl al-Mahalla trade mill. They aborted the strike. They arrested the strike leaders. But the residents of Mahalla, you know, Mahalla is built around that factory in the same way that you would read about, for example, mining towns in the US, where like the entire community is built on the mine, and everyone in town is related to a worker who is working in that mine. The same goes in Mahalla. So when the news leaked that the strike committee was arrested and the strike was aborted, the town erupted in a 2-day uprising, where the residents of Mahalla started stepping on Mubarak's posters. This picture was taken by Nasser Nouri, a friend of mine, in Shon Square in Tanta. And these visuals started to be disseminated on a very wide scale. And this was the beginning of the end of the Mubarak's regime. But during that time, and as dissent was flaming throughout the country, Palestine was always present. There were continuous mobilizations that were happening all the time around Palestine in these years. We did not forget Palestine. And to my pleasure, and not that I was surprised, I always knew that this would happen, many of the social protest leaders and the industrial action leaders, they started showing up for pro-Palestine protests that we used to organize. And on one occasion that I saw with myself, when the workers besieged the parliament in 2010, and then they were dispersed violently by the police forces, they started saying that, they are treating us like the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. They can easily draw parallels all the time. And comes the 25th of January, 2011. This is a picture that I took during the 18 days national uprising. And comrades, it's not a coincidence that the revolution happened at that time. I mean, many people try to theorize about it, that it's because of Twitter, because it's because of Facebook, it's because of the Egyptian police killed a middle-class kid, Khaled Said, who became the icon of the revolution in 2010, and this triggered anti-torture protest that escalated into the revolution. But guess what? Khaled Said was not the first middle-class kid to be killed by the police, and was not the first middle-class kid to be killed by the police, and their plight or their saga was highly publicized. It's been happening before that. And during the revolution, the internet was like shut down for half of the time, and still the revolution continued. So if this was an internet revolution, how did we manage to organize? And if the Khaled Said incident had happened in the year 2000, and it used to happen, it would not have triggered the revolution. If the Khaled Said incident would have happened in 2003, and it happened, it didn't trigger a revolution. If the Khaled Said incident happened in 2006 or 2007 or 2008, and it happened, I mean, 3 people were killed in Mahalla during the April uprising in 2008, but it didn't trigger a revolution. But after an entire decade that started with pro-Palestine organizing, that was breaking Mubarak's wall of fear brick by brick, that was teaching Egyptians experiences on how to organize, on how to resist the police, on how to organize unofficial unions, on how to extend solidarity campaigns, on how to coordinate strike actions. People were building their collective memory for an entire decade. So when 2010 came, and you had the murder of Khaled Said, as well as the collapse of Ben Ali, or the overthrow of Ben Ali in Tunisia, that's when the situation was ripe for a revolution in Egypt. The day Ben Ali fell, I was in Alexandria in a local coffee shop with my comrade, who is one of Egypt's top labor lawyers, Hossam El-Hamalawy. And we were meeting a friend of mine who is a diving instructor who is working in the Red Sea. And he was so inspired by the labor struggles that were happening, and he wanted to create an independent union for diving instructors. Because he and his other colleagues, they were being mistreated, they were being exploited, many of them died because of the lack of industrial safety, and what have you. And so we were meeting this friend of mine, and we were trying to convince him and, transfer experiences to him. I finished 2 minutes. And then the news came on TV that Ben Ali fell. People erupted in cheers at the local coffee shop. And someone said, "Uqbal Mubarak. Mubarak is next." So when 2011 came, and on the 25th of January, which is our Egyptian National Police Day, so we decided to throw the police a party by calling for mass protests in Tahrir Square against the police and against the police brutality, and calling for the impeachment of Habib al-Adli, who is the longest serving interior minister in the history of modern Egypt. And this started to snowball, and then it exploded into the 28th of January, the Friday of Rage, where we burned down roughly 99 police stations across the country, and we took over Tahrir Square. And the Tahrir sit-in started, and that's when the army was also sent in to try to contain the situation. Many liberals in the West, as well as in Egypt, tried to depict this as the revolt of the youth, the internet revolution. It's about democracy. It's about bilingual middle-class kids who are sporting BlackBerry, and they are tweeting, and they want to just bring down the regime to live like we live in the West. and it's all about purely domestic issues that has got nothing to do with foreign policy. But these guys, they could have never showed up in Tahrir during those 18 days because not only because Tahrir was essentially the trajectory that started in the year 2000 with Al-Aqsa Intifada, but there were anti-Israeli and anti-US imperialist banners and slogans all throughout the 18-day uprising. And among the issues that were radicalizing people was the fact that Mubarak is an agent for US imperialism. Mubarak has sold the Palestinians out. Mubarak is extending or tightening the grip of the siege around Gaza. And it's not a coincidence that in 2011, you had mass mobilizations in support of Palestine. There is not literally a single protest that I didn't go, that I went to in 2011, and I didn't see the flag of Palestine. The flag of Palestine was always present in Tahrir, in student mobilizations, and elsewhere. And it's during that year that the Israeli embassy was stormed twice, that the Israeli diplomats had to be smuggled out of the country by the Egyptian military, that there were strong calls to cut the supply of gas to Israel at the time. And hence, and that's what I will conclude with, it's not a coincidence that Palestine would be among the first targets of the counter-revolution as soon as the military coup took place in 2013. The counter-revolution was exacting revenge on every single cause adopted by the revolution. Whether it is the liberation of women, whether it is the liberation of Palestine, whether it is, you name it. In every single cause adopted by the revolution, there was a mass backlash against it. Hence, you can understand why Cairo is one of the biggest enemies of the Palestinians at this point. I will conclude with this. Many outside Egypt are wondering why, isn't the Egyptians protesting in solidarity with the Palestinians, like, the pictures we see in the West? Why isn't the Egyptians protesting like what they did before 2011? But comrades, I don't think that those people have a grasp on the level of repression and the nature of the regime that evolved out of the 2013 coup, and it's still ruling us till today in Egypt. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has Mubarak, he was an autocrat, for sure, but he used to manage dissent. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi eradicates dissent. There is a difference. There is a difference between the two. Every single political party in Egypt has been dismantled. Every single independent trade union has been crushed. Every single community organization has been finished. The Sisi has desertified the political scene completely. So even when we used to get spontaneous protests under Mubarak, they were not completely spontaneous, because they would include somehow like people who were affiliated from near or far with a political party. There were networks that we would depend upon in order to mobilize here and there. But this is now, it's done in Egypt. It's finished. Some people really do not grasp the level of repression that we have seen in these past 10 years in Egypt. You have 2 or 3 generations of Egyptians who have graduated from university and they have never been to a protest. They have never written down a leaflet. They have never stood at, as we say, ma'arad al-talaba, the student exhibitions. That's how we used to operate on the campuses, where you put rocks and then you would put long articles on sheets of paper, and then you start making noise, or you start chanting or making sometimes theatrical, scene, a short theatrical sketch. So people would approach you, they would start reading your articles, and they would get into a debate with you about what you read. People tell you, oh yeah, I agree with this, or oh, what's this shit? But then that's how you create cadres. That's how you create activists. You have 2 or 3 generations who have graduated without a single political experience, without taking part in any student union because they are finished, without taking part in any student strike, without taking part in any march in their neighborhood during parliamentary elections, without knocking on the doors and distributing political leaflets and political propaganda during times of parliamentary elections. Sisi desertified the entire political scene. So that's why what we got last October of like spontaneous protests that lasted for a couple of weeks, during which some of those protests managed to break the security cordons into Tahrir, to chant عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية, which is the same slogans as those of the Egyptian revolution a decade earlier. This is unprecedented. I'm saying this and I'm ending on actually a hopeful note. We as activists, we cannot be pessimistic. We cannot be pessimistic. I mean, we can't afford to be pessimistic. You always have to find the light at the end of the tunnel and some dim light even of hope, or else why would you continue to be alive? So these spontaneous outbursts of protests that happened in Egypt have created for us a relatively new opportunity to start reaching out quietly to some of the student activists that took part spontaneously in it, to have discussions with them, to start networking. But comrades, this will take time. I'm not saying that there will be a revolution tomorrow in Egypt, but I'm saying that this will be the start of maybe another trajectory that might lead in the future to a revolution. And once again, thanks to Palestine. The 2011 revolution did not necessarily break out because Hossam was calling for it, or X was inciting for it, or whoever was demanding this. The 2011 revolution broke out mainly because of 2 reasons. One is political repression and police brutality. And the second is the unequal distribution of wealth, or the question of social justice. Did the counter-revolution present answers to these problems? No, it didn't. It actually made them much worse. This means there is always potential for resistance in the future. And I'm sure that Palestine will continue to be an integral part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hossam. This was truly very interesting and inspiring. Yeah. I think let's open the discussion. So I have many questions myself, and I would love to pick your brain, but
let's see if there is other people on.
So I'm the microphone girl. If you have a question, just raise your hand. Just before you pose the question, we are actually recording. We can't see your faces, but maybe don't say your name in case you, I don't know, for whatever reason.
Thank you very much for your speech. 2 questions, really. One, you said that the current level of repression is hard, right? Would you be able to say a little bit, is it much different than, you said that it's different from Mubarak, right? But you said that those socialist waves were coming and going, right? You think that now is kind of more depressive view comparing to the past? And the second thing, if you could say anything about what kind of angles Sisi's government took to crack down on the socialist movements or any opposition. Is that just the Muslim Brotherhood angle or anything else? What were the key points which allowed them to do the crackdown? Thank you.
Would you like to collect more questions and then answer? Okay. So someone else was raising their hand.
Hello. I was wondering what differences do you see between the Mubarak regime taking on the Palestinian cause and the Sisi regime taking on the Palestinian cause? Because I still have in mind that at least the Mubarak regime spoke out against Israel, which Sisi is very limited at doing so.
Thank you very much for this very rich presentation. You have talked about how Palestine has catalyzed basically internal politics in Egypt, basically since before the Nakba even. And we've seen the rich history of that in Egypt. Now you're based in Berlin, you're based in Europe, and I'm wondering, one, what have you benefited from the Egyptian experience in mobilizing within Europe? And how do you read the situation now in Europe, where we do see some similarities of Palestine catalyzing student movements for liberties within universities, for liberties within society in general, etc.? What potential and what possibilities do you see here? Thank you.
Let me first discuss, the differences between the Mubarak and the Sisi regime. And the differences are tons, but I will focus on the main difference. Under Mubarak, there was a vibrant civil society in Egypt. And civil society here, I mean it in the Gramscian sense. It's this buffer that exists between the state and society. On the one hand, it does protect the state, it protects society from the intrusive power of the state and intrusive interventions. But on the other hand, when you get any sort of social dissent that might explode into a revolutionary upheaval, the civil society tends to absorb it and gear it or channel it towards a reformist sense. And hence you can understand why we didn't finish off this regime on the 28th of January 2011, when we destroyed the police forces on that day. But there was a golden opportunity. But at the same time, most of the forces that were involved in the uprising, actually, they were reformists. And they wanted some sort of reforms, democratic reforms, not like necessarily radical change. So they protected the state from collapsing. Let me give you like a concrete example. Under Mubarak, when there were atrocities flaring in Palestine, and the regime would be worried about a mass public explosion of anger, the regime had the Muslim Brotherhood, which Mubarak absolutely hated, but at the same time made very grateful use of their presence in the universities and in many of the parts and the provinces in Egypt. Mubarak could count on the Muslim Brotherhood to mobilize some protests, including mass protests, that will never leave the university campus. So it will never descend or spill out to the streets, will never clash with the police, and will never chant against Mubarak. They would chant against Israel, they would chant against the US, but they would never chant against Mubarak. And this, Mubarak could count on before he had to send in the central security forces to start cracking heads. If the economic situation is deteriorating and there is so much public anger among the public, among the people, against the regime's austerity policies, Mubarak could depend upon a vast network of Salafi sheikhs, which he absolutely hated, but he could use, and they would go on in the mosques on the Friday ceremonies to blame women and the bankruptcy of morality in Egypt to be behind the rising prices. You know, there was a slogan, you know, that, you know, people laugh at, but like that's what the Salafi sheikhs were saying, like, لن يختفي الغلاء قبل تحجب النساء. Like, you know, how would I say that? I mean, it's so stupid that I can't even, like, you know, the
prices would go down if, yes.
Prices would go down if, you know, women get veiled, basically. The Muslim Brotherhood is gone. The Salafis are gone. If industrial actions broke out, like what they did in Egypt, before sending in the Central Security Forces to crackheads, there was the Tagammu', legal left-wing party. There was the Egyptian Communist Party. There was the state-backed General Federation of Trade Unions, which the regime could depend upon in order to reach a compromise or to diffuse the strike action before sending in the troops. These are all gone now. Under Mubarak, if a problem happens in an urban poor neighborhood, you had the ruling National Democratic Party that was corrupt, full of opportunists, but it included community leaders of people who had social weight in their neighborhoods. And the regime could depend upon them in order to police their neighborhoods before Mubarak sends in the troops. And the ruling National Democratic Party, with all of its roots in all the provinces, can at the same time act as a conflict resolution entity between the people and between the government. So let's say, like, you know, if someone gets tortured and it was like a real horrible abuse, so on occasions his family can go to the local National Democratic Party politicians. It's like, you know, look at what happened to our son. And, you know, the NDP guy could like strike some bargain with the state over some compensation. That ruling National Democratic Party is now gone. The military generals who led the 2013 coup, including Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, saw Hosni Mubarak as too lenient, as too weak, and it's because Hosni Mubarak left those NGOs to operate and left those media personalities to talk criticism and to talk shit about the government and allowed some protests here and there. That's why you had the catastrophe of the 2011, as they named it. كارثة 2011. The catastrophe that happened in 2011. So the kind of regime that evolved out of the 2013 military coup, it's a regime that basically demolished completely the Egyptian civil society. You don't have political parties in Egypt. You don't have dissenting NGOs. You don't have even, like, you know, the state-backed General Federation of Trade Unions is like excuse me, it's nothing now. You don't have student unions. You don't have anything. It's the state micromanaging society on a daily basis using a clique of the repressive apparatus officers from the military, from the security services, and from the GIS, the General Intelligence Service, which is our mukhabarat or our CIA. It's those officers who are micromanaging society on a daily basis. They don't manage dissent. Like if some problem happens in some neighborhood, you don't have a local heavyweight who can mediate between the people and the state. No. They will send in the troops right away to crush it. They are not taking any chances. That is the main difference between the two regimes. One used to manage dissent. One used to depend on some civilian institutions in policing society, while the other that we have today believes that this was the formula that led to the crisis. So we will not have this again. On the one hand, it served them well. I mean, Sisi has been ruling for a decade now. But at the same time, if an explosion happens, I mean here social explosion, there won't be anything that will protect the state from the revolutionary upheaval. So it's a double-edged sword. The crackdown after the coup started with the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists for sure. But quickly, the web of repression started to engulf every single political movement in society. Leftists, liberals, you name it. Even people who supported the coup in the first place, they also fell in that web of repression. Even apolitical charities were dismantled. This is Sisi's vision for how to run society. He wants the state to run society without having any sort of independent entities from outside it. And when I say the state, he even despises the civilian sections and sectors of that state. So he is embarking on militarizing the state organs, not just by pumping military officers in all the ministries and in all the departments and in all the provincial authorities, but now there is a government decree. They started this in 2017, but now it became official in April 2023. Any applicant for a civil service job in Egypt, you have to first go into a 6 months ideological indoctrination boot camp at the Egyptian Military Academy, where you spend 6 months doing physical exercises like any conscript in the army, and you get taught all of these pseudo conspiracy theories that they have dubbed the fourth generation wars. It's about how foreign powers try to bring in states by local actors like myself and other traitors in the country. And it's part of this ideological indoctrination and physical training to break the people. So for example, hundreds of teachers were excluded from their applications for education ministry jobs. Few months ago, after going through this physical training camp, and they were found to be overweight. Pregnant women were disqualified because they are not physically fit to go through this ideological indoctrination boot camp. This is the extent of militarization on steroids that we have in Egypt. And of course, the socialist movement was part of the crackdown.
To the second question, which basically we're asking about the rhetoric basically between Mubarak, who was at least openly against the Israeli regime, but now we have a much more friendly or a much more warmer peace, as he likes to call it. How do you see this?
Since the Camp David, the peace treaty and the Camp David agreement in 1979, Egypt became the second largest recipient of US foreign aid after Israel. And this money and this new alliance that has been forged between the US and the Egyptian regime rested on a very simple formula. You will not go into war with Israel, and you will help us to pacify and stabilize the region. You will protect the flow of maritime traffic through the Suez Canal, and you will protect the flow of oil out of the region. And whenever there are any troubles in the Arab world, you will help us to put them down. And you will help to mediate between the between the Arabs and the Israelis. This mediation, in effect, meant pressuring the Palestinians into compromises. But at least Hosni Mubarak used to play this game where he would bring in a fiery foreign minister who would be denouncing, Israel, and they would be making these fiery statements in the media. But on the ground, business is as usual. The siege of Gaza, it didn't start under Sisi, it started under Mubarak. This picture that you saw a few minutes earlier, this was one of our protests, in front of the press syndicate in 2009, calling for the lifting of the siege on Gaza. But the regime that evolved out of the 2013 military coup is definitely completely in bed with the Israelis. Like, there is no pretense whatsoever. Largely because they both share hatred to the Arab Spring and the revolutionary upheavals that happened. But secondly, it's because Israel saw in Abdel Fattah al-Sisi the kind of model that they want for the Arab world. They want a military autocrat who would put down his people and who would protect their borders. Under Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, something happened which never happened in our history. Sisi allowed the Israeli Air Force to bomb and operate in Sinai on Egyptian land, to bomb alleged terror targets. And this was leaked to the New York Times and to Bloomberg. Hundreds of strikes happened, starting from August 2013 all the way till at least 2017. And some might have happened later, but at least this is the time period that it was documented and everyone knows that it happened. Sisi has dropped the pretense because simply his survival in Egypt has become totally dependent on foreign support. Mubarak used to, as I say, used to make markets. There was a formula for repression. Mubarak enjoyed some support in some sections of society where he would make them invested in his regime. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi doesn't give a shit about the public. This regime is ruling without any broad political alliance. The neoliberal elites that came into existence under Sadat and Hosni Mubarak, these guys have been marginalized now. You now have a bunch of army generals flanked by some generals from the police and from the GIS, our mukhabarat, and they are the ones who run the economy. They are the one who runs the political scene, and they don't really care that much about what the rest of society wants to hear or do. And they don't make any compromises. And they always depend on the fact that Egypt is too big to fail. So even when he's squandering all of these billions on the white elephant projects that he's creating, the Emiratis will bail him out. The Saudis will bail him out. The EU will bail him out. The US will bail him out. The IMF will bail him out because they can't afford another instability or another revolution in the region.
To that answer your question. Then the last question that we received was about basically the parallels between Palestine as a catalyzer in Egypt and also now in Europe. I also, how do you see it in your experience? But also I think it's, how do you see, because maybe a lot of people don't realize how there is also, the police is becoming more and more militarized as also to face the current pro-Palestinian protest across Europe, across the United States. So how much do you see the parallels between what happened in Egypt and now?
I'm currently living in Berlin, which, I mean, I would probably have much more room to operate if I was in Tel Aviv at this point. The situation in Germany is absolutely insane. And they are doing really very embarrassing and childish things, like, banning the red triangle, it's really very childish when you think about it. But I think it just dropped the fig leaf out of European democracies in general. Make no mistake, in Europe and in the US, there is definitely much more room for the freedom of expression and for organizing and there is much more democracy than we have in Egypt. But I've always argued, and this is not some brilliant insight of myself, these are facts. The kind of democratic environment, relatively, that you live under here, it's the product of two things. One is the heroic struggle of the European and the American peoples across the past 2 centuries in order to grab those reforms, on the one hand, and on the other hand, your ruling classes, your ruling elites in the West, they are rich enough and established enough and enjoy a much more hegemonic presence than the autocracies that we have in the global South. So they can afford making some concessions. But when the shit hits the fan and it really becomes, and when they become really insecure, they start acting like any global South autocracy. I mean, like seriously, if you're following German media, this is no different than what the Egyptian media was saying in 2011. Like we used to have this crazy guy called Tawfiq Okasha. It's no different, than this. And all sorts of conspiracy theories. Left-wing conferences are being banned in Germany because it's run by Islamists. When people go out on the streets, making the sign, which is like any Muslim knows, this is a sign of Tawheed, The Berlin police say, we've arrested 5 people who were like raising the IS finger, the Islamic State finger, like it's like as if they are the Daesh. It's such a crude and childish and embarrassing level that the Western democracies are behaving in. But guess what? Because they are not different. They are not different than Sisi. They are not different than any of the global South autocracies. They are just much more established. They are just much more secure. In Egypt, and I always used to hear this from my comrades in the 1990s when I first joined the Egyptian Revolutionary Socialists at the time. I remember one of my comrades telling me that if we manage to replicate what happened in 1977, if we manage to sustain those protests for a week, this regime is not gonna last. Just a week. I used to hear this in the 1990s, and this is what happened. We just managed to sustain the protests in Tahrir on that hard scale for 4 days till we reached the Friday of Rage, and it was game over for Mubarak. But here, you have much more room for maneuver. But it's these radicalizations and mobilizations that are happening that's basically exposing how phony those democracies are. And currently, the Palestinian cause is playing the same role that the Vietnam War was doing in the 1960s. I mean, much more, a lot of the social movements that exploded in the US in the 1970s and in Europe around that time, and this huge rise of the left in that decade came as a reaction, and it was sparked by the anti-Vietnam War movements at the time. And I think Palestine now is doing the same. Now, the development of that movement is not inevitable. It will depend on so many subjective factors. Are we organized enough? Do we have clear politics of who's the enemy? Are we only here for a ceasefire and then when it's over, we'll just go home? Or are we gonna start building on those networks that we are creating at the moment? Are we gonna try to reach out to the working class in our countries? Because at the end of the day, one strike at a port that exports shipments to Israel, that's much more powerful than 100 student encampments. With all due respect, of course, to the student struggles that I'm for. No, definitely, I'm not ridiculing it. But if you get one strike at an airport from where, shipments are being, sent to Israel and munitions, you are definitely ending the war. So, do you have the clear strategy for this? Or at least, are you trying to? Or not? I mean, it depends. But, again, I'm always optimistic because we can't afford to be pessimistic.
Do you have any follow-up comments or any further?
I have a question.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, this question is for you, Ahmed, actually. So, as we've learned from Hossam that the dissent has been dissolved, I was wondering about the current situation in Egypt, about the everyday life since October, about the sentiments between the simple people, the vendors, your colleagues, maybe students, in regard to have there been any protests? If yes, how were they met? Yes, if you can give us a bit of an insight as how the situation currently is.
So I'm not sure I'll be adding much more than what was already said, but practically there is no, at least that's how I feel it really, like our society is being really completely fragmented. We're now standing as individuals and remnants of older networks that are completely underground. So basically when some people manage to create some protests that were spontaneous and they made it all the way to Tahrir, this did not last at all. Like 2 days afterwards, they are still arrested until now, even though at the time, at least some people allege that Sisi's regime needed those protests for propaganda to say that we have some popular unrest and we need to pressure the stopping of the war. He needed this just for image, but of course people did not fall for that, and they always went and chanted what's right, so they arrested all of them. There were attempts to do protests inside some universities. They arrested the leaders of the student movement. But nonetheless, I believe from like the normal, let's say, average, everyone is completely, there is no place in Cairo now without, or actually elsewhere in Egypt, without a Palestinian flag. I believe the current wave of boycott is one of the most, how do you call it, grassroots movements that are completely spontaneous, not complete, like largely spontaneous, and very effective. We had a lot of boycott calls in the years 2000 that ended, but so far it's still sustaining, which is very impressive. But again, this is within the limits of what we have. I don't know if Hossam would like to add anything else. Any further questions, comments? Great. Do you have any closing comments, Hossam?
I'll just say one thing. A friend of mine was arrested in 2003. He's a close friend of mine. He's a comrade and a journalist. And he was arrested while organizing against the war in Iraq at the time. And he's very highly, I mean, he's a very tempered person. So usually whenever we're arrested by state security police at the time, you know, there is like strategy for counter-interrogation, and you know, that like depends on like do not provoke them, but you know, you only say the information that's on your ID. You just say your name, and you just say, you know, where you live. If they ask you about your mother, I haven't seen her in ages. If you ask about your brother, I don't know anything about him. You know, my family's broken. You ask. Like it's only this information together, and you demand to be transferred, you know, to the court. Of course, you know, they will beat you, they will electrocute you, they will, you know, I mean, abuse you. But if you stick to this, usually, you know, the torture is like very limited, and you know, you will get away with it, and they will not turn you into an informer, because usually people who start speaking, they are the ones who get tortured the most. Because if they slap you and they start, you know, I mean, speaking, then they will slap you 10 times so as to get them more information. And then whenever any shit happens in your neighborhood or in any university, they will get you because you're the one who used to speak, you know. So anyways, so this guy, without mentioning names, he actually has his own way. Like, you know, he beats his interrogator. Like, basically, like, you know, I mean, he fights back, you know, they electrocute, so, you know, he kicks them, you know. So it's... which, you know, I mean, I don't recommend for anyone at any point, whether in Switzerland or in Egypt or elsewhere. But anyway, like, you know, he was like severely tortured in that arrest. One night, the torture stopped. And then his interrogators asked him, who is your contact in the foreign ministry? Who's your wasta, as we say in Arabic? Who's your wasta in the foreign ministry? And the torture stopped, and he was released actually, you know, shortly after. And it is because there were small protests in front of the Egyptian embassies and consulates at the time, outside Egypt. Not mass hundreds of thousands of people. You know, there were dozens. On a good day, it could be 200 of people protesting in front of the Egyptian embassies, demanding the release of my comrade at the time. This made the torture stop, and this secured his release. Because, of course, there must have been some foreign ministry diplomat on the line talking to Cairo, like, you know, who the hell is this guy? You know, he's causing us so much headaches, why don't you just release him to get it over with? Unless, he's like some serious terrorist. I'm saying this because, you, as people who live in the West, you have so much power in order to influence how things are happening in the global South that sometimes you do not really appreciate and estimate well. Our regimes are dependent on foreign support in the end. They have zero legitimacy among the people, but they can only continue to rule because the Germans are giving them arms, because the French are selling them arms, because the EU is bailing them out to do their white elephant projects. And of course, they keep, their money here probably a few meters away. And any form of dissent that happens in these centers of the capitalist system, of this global power matrix, it reverberates right away. And it does make a severe impact where we live. Probably Sisi would not have gotten away with so much abuses and violations that he did if there was a strong Egypt solidarity movement in the Western countries that are supporting him, of people who are demonstrating in front of the German arms companies and corporations that are giving him arms, in front of the French surveillance tech companies that are selling him surveillance technology, in front of the EU Parliament in Brussels and elsewhere that is signing off all of these blank checks in order to help him out and bail him out from his economic crisis. So sometimes some little actions that you can do here in Switzerland or elsewhere, it can make one hell of a huge impact back home. So Palestine is not going to be liberated before Egypt is liberated, unfortunately. And it doesn't have to do anything, that the Palestinians are not courageous enough or they are not resisting enough. They are doing actually fantastic work. But the biggest clientelistic regime in the region that is oppressing the biggest working class in the region, that's oppressing the biggest peasantry class in Egypt, that's oppressing the biggest urban poor communities in Egypt, this regime is supported by the West. If it collapses, if it gets overthrown, this means the entire Arab region is going to be on fire. And we already saw glimpses of it in 2011. And it will happen again. This is not some wishful thinking. Again, because there are structural reasons for the revolts that happened in 2011. I'm not saying that the victory of such revolutions when they happen in the future is inevitable. No. It depends, are we organized enough? Are we prepared enough? Have we managed to rebuild our networks that were completely destroyed by the military regime or not? And do we have allies abroad, like yourselves, who are organized enough and who have the political clarity to see that it's not just enough to secure a ceasefire in Palestine, which is, of course, this is the number one demand, that we have to achieve now. But actually, the keys to liberation, they lie in Cairo. And if Cairo continues to be like it is, this will always be a barrier towards the liberation of Palestine. I joined the socialist movement when a comrade actually convinced me, as a disillusioned Arab nationalist at the time, that the road to Jerusalem passes through Cairo and the Arab capitals. And I still think that this thesis is valid today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.